Hello, welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you have not been here before. Today I'm doing a colored pencil tutorial. It's been a while since I've done one. We're going to do a background for this beautiful macaw, and the style of background is going to be a blurred out of focus kind of bokeh or bokeh effect. I don't know how to say it. I'm using my Caran d'Ache Luminance colored pencils for this, but whatever colored pencils you have work. Prismacolor work really well because they're also wax-based pencils, so it's easy to blend them out with the solvent. I'm going to go over the specific colors in a little bit, but first I want to talk about a few solvent related things. For some of you who may not be super familiar with solvent, you can blend out solvent with a paintbrush that is strong enough to kind of push the pigment around, or you can use Q-tips, which is what I'm going to be using because my paintbrush is not very good at it. Also, if you're new here, this is not my first solvent video. I have one I posted about a year ago with a slightly different looking background than the one I'm going to do today, and I will put a little card up in case you're interested in seeing that as well. Okay, let's jump into materials really quickly. So I'm using Strathmore mixed media paper. Basically the guidelines for paper with solvent, you want something that's thick enough to hold the liquid medium because solvent, of course, is a liquid. You don't want your paper to be too thin or frail so that it will warp. So something like this would be a great option for what paper to use. As for the solvent itself, I'm using this Gamsol 100% odorless pure mineral spirit, which I found at a craft store, I believe Michael's or Hobby Lobby. This is pretty easy to find. I never have an issue with it. Just make sure to keep your space well ventilated. And really quickly, last thing before we get into it, I'm doing a color swatch for those of you who are interested in color matching or seeing what exact colors from the Caran d'Ache set I'm using. Now, Caran d'Ache offers a lower range of colors than sets like Polychromos and Prismacolor. I'm using kind of a diverse range of greens, yellowish greens, and cream and white here. And the solvent is going to help me get a nice, diverse, and colorful blended background for this beautiful macaw that I'm going to be drawing. Now that we're done with all of that, we could start with the actual coloring process, which is great. So the first thing I'm going to do is erase my graphite with a kneaded eraser. I have these circles sketched in, as you can see. It's very important to erase the graphite because if you leave any graphite, what's going to happen is when you go in later with your solvent, you can actually smudge the graphite and the graphite will just be like smudged on the paper. It will be impossible to get rid of. So I learned this the hard way. You really have to get rid of any excess graphite before you even attempt to start coloring. And then also, you have to make sure you're coloring in the same direction. So I'm going to be coloring vertically, and that way it's consistent across the entire background. The entire thing will be colored vertically. Any pencil lines will be vertical, and everything will be even. When I do go in with my solvent, I can blend vertically as well, and then I have a nice, consistent blended background. This is especially important because with colored pencil, you can't really avoid pencil marks altogether. So you want to make sure they're at least consistent so that the solvent doesn't create a bunch of streaks and weird random pencil strokes in random directions. I'm also going to try to blur out the edges of the circles sometimes a little bit so that they don't look too sharp. Definitely don't outline the circle. Definitely don't do that because if you create like a bold outline around each circle, it's not going to look realistic. So you want to kind of just create a very gentle kind of, not border, but a very gentle blend around the circle so that it looks a little bit more natural, and that's what I'm attempting to do. So I'm going to be really careful around the edges. Of course, if you're even more careful than me, you can get a perfectly symmetrical circle each time too, which I did not completely get, but you can get that effect. By the way, I did want to mention I have my paper taped down, as you can obviously see, because I want to have some white borders around my drawing. But if you don't tape your paper down and you're just going to color all the way to the border, when you do go in with solvent, it might be a good idea to tape your paper down or secure it some way so that your paper doesn't shift around when you're using solvent, which is a liquid medium, and you have to be very kind of careful with that. The rest of this is pretty much me just coloring this entire section, so I will skip ahead to the solvent process so that you're not watching me color this entire section with the same technique and tactic the entire time. But I do want to mention how important it is that you get in enough pigment so that the solvent has something to work with and blend, and that it's even. So I'm working really hard to get everything nice and blended as much as possible. I'm not just going to kind of scribble on the color and hope the solvent can blend everything out. I'm obviously trying to blend those greens together as best I can without actually burnishing and pressing really hard, just a nice medium pressure, and I want it to look nice before I add the solvent because the solvent isn't going to fix any streaks or anything like that. The solvent might make that worse. So the solvent is great for blending, but only if you have a nice blend kind of already and a consistent amount of pigment and a very nice job of coloring and everything like that. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to the first layer of solvent on this top section. And I'm going to be using a Q-tip to blend it out. So what I want to do is very carefully dip the Q-tip into the solvent and wipe off any excess on a paper towel and just experiment with how much solvent I need. And I'm just going to start off with one of the circles, and it looks like it's a good amount of solvent. You want to practice probably on a separate paper if you've never done this before, because too much solvent won't be good, and too little solvent, of course, isn't going to do very much. And the amount of solvent is an important thing, as well as you have to be careful if your Q-tip is already dirty with a dark color. Don't use that same side of the Q-tip on a lighter section. You obviously want to color in the same direction, so I'm going to be coloring or shading vertically. No, I'm going to be blending vertically the same way that I was coloring vertically on the background, and I think that helps to eliminate any streaks or problem areas compared to if you just were blending in random directions. That's not a very good idea. You have to be kind of gentle and careful with your blending technique while using the solvent. As I mentioned before as well, you want to make sure that you don't accidentally drag some of the pigment, the dark pigment, into the light areas. So you might want to use the opposite end of the Q-tip, one side of the Q-tip for dark areas and one side for light areas, so that you are extra careful and you don't get any dark pigment in the light areas. Another thing I want to mention is don't overdo an area. So if you get like a streaky or messy result, don't try to keep working on it. Just leave it alone and let it dry, and you can actually go over it with pencil again later and fix it. Don't overwork any area. Just blend it out the first time and then just leave it alone, because if you overwork it, all sorts of horrible things can happen, trust me. So as I'm waiting for that area to dry, as you can see, I colored down the entire background on the left side. So that area is drying now, and I'm going to go ahead and start coloring on the right side. I do recommend doing this if you don't want to wait so long for one area to dry. You might as well just color one area first and then another separate section afterwards. That's what I kind of like to do because I'm very impatient. So as that's drying, I'm gonna work and add some light areas. There's a lot of lighter areas going on the right side. A lot of confusion too, because a lot of the circles are like white and blended in together on the very right. So this is going to be fun. And sometimes with these types of backgrounds, there are some areas that are very either white or very, very light, and you have to be very careful with that. My method, of course, for this section will be the same as my method for the previous section, but there are going to be some white circles and some brighter white areas that I didn't have in that first section. I'm going to be very careful with those. And I'm just kind of shading vertically, making sure to add enough pigment even in the light areas, just making sure that everything looks nice and even and ready before I start to use my solvent for this area. I'm kind of being careful around the bird's feathers because I have to make sure that I erase some of the graphite that's too close to the pencil, because again, I don't want my solvent to create a graphite blend and smear the graphite all over the place. And now I can go in and blend out this area very quickly with the solvent. And as that's drying, I'm going to go back to the first section that I did, which is now obviously dry. And I can actually start to work on that section and fix any of those issues that I had with it before. One of the best things about solvent is that once it dries, you can go in and rework some areas and add another layer and just fix any mistakes that are there. And that's kind of cool because you can't do the same if you just blend with a pencil and you end up blending very hard. You can't really go back and fix it. So I'm starting to add a second layer with my colored pencils here. I'm going to redefine some of those circles because even though I don't want them to be overly defined, I think they're a bit underdefined right now and a bit messy and sloppy. So you can really fix any issues you had with your first blend of solvent with a second layer of pencil, and you don't really even have to blend out with the solvent again if you don't want to, because the white areas are already gotten rid of, and it's much easier to kind of just color in and fix anything that's wrong and not necessarily have to add more solvent, but you can of course add more solvent if you need to blend any areas out. So it's really your choice, and that's one of the really cool things about solvent. So I am going to just go and fix some of these areas that I needed to fix, and then after I'm all done with that, I can actually move on to the second section, which of course needs an additional layer of pencil desperately, as you can see. So I kind of will just let you guys watch this process for any of you who are interested, and then I will start talking and giving tips again once I move on to that second section. Alright, so I've worked on some of those areas. Now I'm going to move on and do a second layer on the second section. And for this, I'm being careful as well because I am darkening some areas up a little bit, but I want to make sure I don't accidentally darken them up too much, which can happen sometimes, especially because I need to cover up some of the streaks and some of the things I didn't like about the first layer that I did. And so I want to still be careful to preserve some of those highlighted areas and some of those light areas. And then I go in and of course blend that out again with the solvent, and I'm just kind of finishing up that section there. Then when that dries, of course, if there's anything I need to fix, then I can do that. So as you can kind of tell, using solvent is a little bit of a process. It's going to take a while between letting areas dry and everything like that. Now I can go in and blend out those circles, which I fixed a lot of them and made them a little bit nicer and sharper looking. So I'm going to go in and blend out the pigment on some of those, which kind of just brings everything together, makes everything look a lot nicer. A lot of this is going to be me doing kind of the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and speed through some of these clips. This is just going to be me kind of revising areas, fixing them, layering, and then I will skip ahead and start talking a little bit about how I rendered that area on the right side with all of those white circles. Okay, so I've done enough touch-ups on the rest of the background, and now I'm going to try and blend some of those white circles a little bit better into the background by using my lightest cream color to kind of blur out those edges and give the impression that there are circles and shapes there and it's not just like a big white blob. Now this is going to be a little bit challenging because I don't want to create too much definition to the circles. I still want to have that blurry effect, and you notice that on the edges of all the circles we do have a lot of those cream colors that I added, so you can kind of see them and they look a little bit more defined now than they did before. And then towards the bottom I'm even using my green to define some of those circles as well. And some of them I'm going to leave a little bit less defined, others I'm going to define them a little bit more. And then I'm left with this nice background for this macaw, and that's how I got to this point and how I rendered this background. And that's pretty much all I have for today's video. Unfortunately, I don't have the macaw finished so I could show you the final result yet. I do have a little bit more of it worked on though, but this is all I have today. I hope that today's video was enjoyable and helpful for you guys, and if you are interested in seeing that other video on solvent backgrounds that I have up, I can actually link it. I think I actually have 2 videos on solvent backgrounds backgrounds that I can link for you guys to watch. So thank you so much for watching today's video. Please leave a comment, let me know what you think about this or what you think about the drawing in general, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye guys!